Thank you, Concordia, for inviting me. First of all, it is an honor to be invited, and I really enjoy being able to speak on this topic that's so near and dear to my heart. I'm going to start by introducing myself and just let you know how I sort of got to become where I am here now today as the assignment producer for CBC Indigenous. And I hope to answer the question why I am the president of the Native American Journalists Association. I also want to say that I also represent the World Press Freedom Canada, and I'm a director on that board. And that is another topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is press freedom. So as Robin mentioned, my name is Francine Compton. I want to say Anin. I am Anishinaabe. My First Nation is Sandy Bay Ojibwe First Nation. That's where I have my citizenship from. My father is from a different First Nation called Kisikoos First Nation. That's in Saskatchewan. And my dad is an influential person in my life and in the lives of many Indigenous storytellers. And we are all storytellers at heart. And so journalism is, I want to say, nothing new to us. It's always been a part of our culture and our history. And we've passed down many stories through those oral histories. So my father told me when I was trying to decide which high school to go to, he told me that one day we would have the world's first national Indigenous television network. He told me we would have our own network one day. And he also said to go and study broadcasting. And I was about 15 or 16, looking for the high school that I was going to choose. When my father told me we would have our own network, I didn't believe him. I thought that he was dreaming. And I found it really hard to believe that we would have our own network one day. I grew up in Winnipeg, and you may recall that Maclean's magazine once labeled this city as Canada's most racist city. So, growing up in a city such as this, it was really hard to visualize myself as a reporter, an anchor, a director, or anyone working in the business, quite frankly. So when I got this news, as a teenager that we were going to have our own network one day, I decided to just listen to my dad, go and study broadcasting. And I did that in high school. I had a really great opportunity at Tekvok High School in Winnipeg, a radio and television broadcasting program. And it was fun. It was fun to be in school. I got to try shooting, editing, writing, directing. I was able to do the audio work. And I even remember being able to do some weather anchoring. And I had a lot of fun with the green screen. So I was in that environment, but even in that environment, I still had a struggle believing that I would land a job in the industry. The instructors were industry people. They've had careers in the industry. And, a lot of times there was this notion being shared that, and maybe it's old school. I remember hearing, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And I, in school, thought like, well, I don't know that many people. And my chances of knowing a lot of people are very slim. So I better know a lot. And I better come out of this school knowing a lot. But I don't know where I'm going to go when I'm done this school. I really didn't have a hope. I didn't see myself getting a job at CBC. I did not see myself being on air. I didn't have a hope of becoming a reporter or a camera operator, or even a microphone holder, to be honest. But what I saw over the years growing up was, I think, some things that kept me going. because I had my first exposure to a control room and a newsroom when I was in kindergarten. My dad took me to CBC Winnipeg and toured me around the control room and the studio. And I still remember it to this day, being in the control room and looking down at the studio and seeing a female anchor sitting there. And I thought I could be like her one day. Her name's Sandra Lewis. And I aspired to be an anchor like her because I saw a woman at the anchor desk. She wasn't an Indigenous woman, but as a little girl, I saw a woman who I could aspire to be like. And it was wonderful being able to have that exposure, but also I did get to meet my idol news anchor when I was a kid, Sandra Lewis. I got to meet her at the CBC Kids Christmas party, got a picture with her, and I still have it to this day. So, you know, I had that exposure. I know a lot of kids don't get that, but for me, I was also taken on a shoot in kindergarten. I remember my dad asking me to walk out of the school doors a few times, and I was thinking, like, how many times do I got to do this? Like, you know, don't they have the shot? But I remember being in pink snow pants, and you know, those are some memories as a kid that I'll never forget. And you know, they stuck with me. And when it came time to actually go and study broadcasting, I could think back to those things. I could also think back to seeing my dad on TV on the 6 o'clock news every night. And he is the first visibly Indigenous man who was on television news in Canada in the 80s. And by visibly Native, I mean he has braids and wears them in front, and he wore ribbon shirts on air. But he was not an Indigenous beat reporter. He did community stories. He is a guy who grew up in Winnipeg and wanted to report on his community and tell colorful stories and inspire. So what happened with his career, it does connect to mine because he aspired to be a national reporter for CBC and wasn't seeing that possibility. And our lives changed when my dad went to work for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. That was the Canadian government at the time wanted to study how to make the lives of Aboriginal people in Canada better. This is before the TRC. This is before the MMIWG inquiry report. This is before the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry report around that time as well. This Royal Commission report for Aboriginal peoples had a recommendation to create a national television network for Aboriginal people. And that recommendation did become a reality, with APTN in 1999 launching as the world's first national Indigenous television network. My dad is a founder, and when I saw that network launching and coming, I wanted to work for it. Everything really timed out very well in my high school years, and I'm going to tell you, I was a high school dropout. I did drop out, but I picked myself back up, and I knew I needed to complete this degree. I was almost done. I was almost there, and thank goodness I did. I graduated in 1999 with radio, television, broadcasting diploma at high school. And I took that and I ran with it. It was what I had. And that was, you know, APTN was coming. We knew it was coming, but we didn't know how big it was gonna be. So that summer, I was able to land a summer internship with CBC. I got to work on the Pan Am Games. I was working in the broadcast center and, you know, falling more and more in love with this industry through that exposure. But, you know, I knew that APTN was coming, and I just wanted to work there, and I didn't know how it was going to happen. I landed an opportunity again. And this was to host a show that was going to be on APTN when it launched. And this show was for an independent production company. They wanted a host reporter. And I came on. That was my second job out of high school. So I was host reporting a show that was going to be on APTN when it launched. And my first assignment was probably one of the biggest assignments of my careers, even today, thinking back on it. I was assigned a story on Buffalo Point First Nation in Manitoba. And Buffalo Point First Nation is very unique. They have a hereditary chief who is non-Indigenous. And the people of Buffalo Point First Nation back in the day were protesting against their chief and council and leadership. They wanted transparency. They wanted to know how economic developments were being done in their community. They wanted to know about the cottages being built on their shores in their community. And as a 19-year-old, I just was like, yeah, I'm going. Tell me what to do, producer. I will go and have a sit-down interview with this chief in his office, in the band office that was just occupied by protesters. And point blank ask him, how he feels about being a non-Indigenous hereditary chief. And that's even complicated in its own history. His non-Indigenous father was adopted by the First Nations chief of Buffalo Point. And that man passed down his hereditary chieftainship to his adopted son, who passed it down to his blood son. That story gave me a career-changing opportunity, not because I sat down with that chief and asked accountability questions to him on behalf of the people, but my first scrum was also assigned. And anytime I see a young person going out to a scrum today, I think about how brave they are, and I think about the adrenaline, and I listen to their question, because I think about myself at that time, again, still 19, and hosting a show called Medicine Wheel for APTN. My assignment was to go to the next location of the people's protest, and that was in the lobby of the Indigenous Affairs Office, the INAC office, which at the time was Indian Affairs. The folks were sitting in and protesting in the lobby. I showed up with my camera operator, and the big heavyweights were there, the mainstream media, the ones that I had always looked up to and aspired to work for one day. So I heard them asking questions to the INAC spokesperson about financial accountability and the relationship between chief and council and Indian Affairs. And I just felt that these were the same old questions. I felt that the people that were there were almost invisible to what was unfolding in front of us. And I knew as a young reporter that I had to ask a question. There's no way I was showing up to this press conference without asking a question. And I probably had a shaking microphone, but I put my microphone out there and I asked the Indian Affairs spokesperson, I said, what do you have to say about the chief who is allegedly withholding their social assistance checks, and it's 2 weeks before Christmas? When I asked that question, I don't remember her answer, but I do remember that the people that were there protesting, they cheered and they said, yeah, what about that? Because I had been hearing that from them and nobody asked that. And so I felt it was my duty, not just as the reporter that was there, but it was also my duty, because of the blood that runs through me, to ask the question on behalf of the people who have not had media representation until today, until me being there with my microphone, my cameraman. My cameraman was an Indigenous person, and he grabbed my hand after I asked that question. And you know what? I think it helped me, prevented me from falling to the ground because yeah, my adrenaline was high. You know, it was a moment. And he told me that he did that because he said that that was the moment that I decided what I was going to be, what kind of journalist I was going to be. And I've seen that moment happen a lot of times over my career at APTN. And I wanted to start today's discussion with that because that sets the stage for the last 22 years of my experience covering Indigenous news, politics, not just federal, but also First Nations politics. And coming off this election, I think it would be wonderful to see more of an interest in First Nations politics and the stories that go on in our communities. Before I move on to the next topic that I wanted to get to, which is reporting for First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities, I want to remind you that we can get some questions of yours out in the chat. And you can also turn on your microphone and camera to jump in and ask me a question. I'm comfortable with you doing that at any point in time. So if there's something that I've said that has raised a question, drop it in, turn on your camera. Otherwise, I'll keep going. There's a lot for me to cover, and it's really wonderful to be able to have the time to do it. So I will carry on with the next area, and that is the privilege to be able to report for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. I don't say on or in, I say for, because these are the communities that need news reporting done for them. And my mission, my big hope and dream, you know, one day, maybe in the next 20 to 22 years, is to see Indigenous journalists everywhere, to be able to see Indigenous journalists in their own communities if they want to be able to hold their own leadership accountable in their own communities and be able to share their community stories with the public. With the start of APTN, it was a really great opportunity for me to be able to explore all of the things that I learned in high school. My first role there was to start the studio crew. And again, I was really dreaming and wishing that I could work there. What happened was I did one season of Medicine Wheel. It aired on APTN. And even though I had this really great job and a hosting and a show, I was like, I want to work there. That's the place, that's the network. And I got in through a internship. Again, it was an internship. There was 6 folks who were brought in to start the studio crew for APTN. And we were going to launch the first ever Indigenous newscast. But they had no crew. They had journalists, they had producers, they had a director, and they got a bunch of us young kids to come in and start the studio crew. And this, I don't think happens anywhere. We were all gathered in the control room and asked, what job do we want? And all the guys, I was the only female in the group of 6. The other 5 guys jumped on all the great positions. I thought, you know, one of them said, I'll be the switcher, I'll be the audio guy, and I'll be the Chiron, the CG operator. And I was kind of left with like the last choice, which turned out to be the best. I was left with the script assistant, which is the assistant director. And I thought, yeah, I can do that. I learned how to do that in school. I time everything, I count down, I support the director. And we just got put into drills. It was rehearsals and drills. And, you know, we were doing the first newscast, the first election coverage, the first town hall. And it was, you know, what a life to be able to be part of all of those firsts, to be able to do it with, you know, we would joke around, and I called everyone at APTN, my family, you know, these guys that I worked with. I'm Anishinaabe, they're Anishinaabe, Dakota, you know, we're relatives, and you know, we when I left APTN, I called those my glory days. And heck, there was a lot of glory days, but you know, those beginnings, we really had to prove ourselves. And as the network was proving itself to the world, I was inside proving myself to the network because I just wanted more. We had one newscast a week. We had a current affairs show a week. I said, you know what? I'm going to do youth stories. I'm going to be the youth reporter. And I just went out and did it. I told the news producers, I need a camera. I want to do stories, and I'm going to learn how to edit. And I just did it. And I don't even know who gave me permission, but it had to be done. I had time. It was literally, the network was like my playground. I could pick up a camera, I could shoot, I could edit. And I think myself being super loud, super vocal, and just like getting my hands into everything, it caught the attention of the news director. And an opportunity came up by the time I was 21, and that was to become the director. And I was mentored by 3 different guys from CBC, old school guys, directors, sports directors, news directors, current affairs directors. But I got the boot camp. I got the real hands-on training. I was directing all of APTN's coverage of the North American Indigenous Games in 2002. I was directing all of the town halls, up to 9 or 11 cameras sometimes, commanding a camera operator for each camera, audio crew, everything. And that was a dream come true, a dream that I didn't even know that I had, but it was a dream come true. My supporters were there beside me, and literally beside me. I was the director. My brother from Sandy Bay, Ojibwe First Nation, my Anishinaabe brother was there switching. And you know what? It's just like that, and that's an adrenaline rush. That was one of the best adrenaline rushes of my career, but a lot of really good lessons learned, because there was a lot of weight on my shoulders. I knew that everything that was being put to air was at my command, and I never wanted to go to black or put up bars or make a mistake. And you know, there was decisions also that had to be made, and I started really seeing how I was grasping what was going on editorially, because I'm listening to all the stories, I'm listening to all the interviews, I'm seeing how they're being packaged and put together and introduced by anchors, and I'm there. I'm the last point, you know, and there were times where the producers were behind me, and they couldn't decide quick enough. I would be there seeing an accident coming. We're about to go to black. I don't know where we're going. They're not telling me where we're going. So I have to decide what's next. And I did that. And when I saw my strengths, I said to myself, I can be a producer. And that's what I want to be. I need to be in a position where I can have decision-making powers, not just on how the shows look, not just on what kind of colorful backgrounds we have, not just on which graphics we use to represent these stories, but on who we talk to, how they're framed editorially. And, you know, making those decisions, it was hard to make those decisions, but I want to tell you what influenced me then and always is my people, the people. And I think about the viewers who are watching. I think about all of the Indigenous people, the First Nations people who have always wanted to see this. There were folks who, you know, only saw my dad as the one Indigenous reporter on TV for decades. And then finally, here we are with an Indigenous anchor, reporters all over the country. And all of us in the crew here were from various First Nations. So that's always influenced me and driven me, knowing that we're delivering, we have a responsibility. Our public responsibility is to our communities to be able to deliver news to them and to be able to present it in a beautiful way, on TV that they can enjoy, and finally be able to have, all of the bells and whistles, the beautiful studio, the lights, the camera, the action. So for me, my influence and my driving force is always the people. And that's because First Nations people have not always had journalists to represent them, to take their questions from the ground of their community and bring that to the Prime Minister or the Indigenous Services Minister. And I've come to learn that journalism is meant to change the lives of people, of citizens, and hold elected officials to account. And that's another thing that influences me and keeps me going, is that belief in this field, that the work that we do, it can impact change and make lives better for the people who are there in First Nations and Inuit communities. So I'm really glad that that question was asked. Thank you for asking me that, Simona. There's another one here. What was it about youth stories that spoke to you when you first began as a journalist? I like this one because I felt that we finally had our own network, we had our newsroom, and I felt that there were older, more seasoned reporters and producers, and they were really looking, at that news and the politics and the history. And I felt that young people also needed to be heard and a voice and a place. And I thought, I'm young, and I feel like that I could make that connection to young voices who may not be comfortable talking to, an older producer or an older reporter, because they may view that person like an auntie or an uncle, and I would just really felt like I was at the level of the youth, and that there were so many amazing things that youth are doing, that I wanted it to be on APTN News. For example, one thing I did was the Manitoba Aboriginal Youth Achievement Awards. There were at least a dozen, maybe 24 award winners in various categories. So I just wanted to profile them. There was a young girl in photography, and she was being honored for her work in that area. So I went and did a story on her, got all of the really neat angled shots where she's got her photography light and it clicks, and it was fun. And for me, it was like, just do it. Just do stories, do as many as you can. You can't sit here while there's all this amazing equipment and there's all these amazing stories out there, and you have a platform. You can pick up that camera right there, and then you can go into that edit suite there. But for me, the real heart of it was knowing that their stories were inspirational, and I wanted to share more of them, because I felt like I was able to meet a lot of other inspirational youth, like in my circles and through some of the internships that I've done. And they let me, they let me do so many things. The news anchor, I want to share this story. The news anchor was going out on a shoot one time, and she said, I'm going to go and interview the new national chief of the AFN. We're going to go to his community out in Quebec. And, who do you think I should take to shoot for me? And I just said, me, I want to go. I could have recommended one of the guys on the crew, but I wanted to go. I wanted an opportunity to shoot, to be in a community. And we went, and I worked hard. We shot a few stories. We shot dozens of promos. And I got to interview, Matthew Kuncum, the national chief of the AFN, with the anchor at the time. And that was, for me, that was just the start of me volunteering and saying I could do anything and just give me a chance. So really, really inspirational times in those beginning years at APTN, seeing us cover the elections from an Indigenous perspective for the first time. doing town halls in a room full of Indigenous people and allowing them to come up to a microphone and ask questions. You know, the way we were seeing it done on TV all these years, we were doing that and being able to bring that to the people. We traveled all around Canada and brought these town halls to Yellowknife, Halifax, Regina. But, you know, in thinking about that, we had learned a lot of lessons. You know, we were APTN. We were supposed to be covering First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And our newsroom needed to be able to represent that community. We needed to be able to have our journalists on the ground and in the places that we were trying to report on. And so that was the mission, that we had a journalist based in Iqaluit, so that we could have stories from Inuit communities and have that journalist travel around to all the communities and bring us stories from there. The same thing with First Nations. You know, there have been times throughout the 22 years where APTN encountered some hesitancy, some reluctance from communities to have media there, even though we were Indigenous media, APTN. And when those things happened, it surprised me. You know, I thought really that communities would be more welcoming to the fact that we were an Indigenous outlet and be more comfortable with us, but we were still labeled as that media, you know, that media that's been doing that type of coverage all these years. And, you know, some First Nations are a lot more welcoming to media and a lot more savvy. We got to understand, though, and one of the things that we've learned even very recently is that you could encounter communities where there are different types of leaderships and they may not be in agreement with what's going on in their nation, in their community. There are various ways of governing First Nations. Some, as I mentioned, there was the Buffalo Point First Nation with a hereditary system. The Wet'suwet'en story that unfolded a couple of years ago, and we could say still unfolds, there is an elected Indian Act leadership, and that is one government that a journalist could talk to. And on the other hand, there is hereditary leadership for that same nation. And those two bodies of leadership may not have the same vision, may not agree to the same things going on in their nation. And, you know, as a journalist, it's a bit of a gray area, but there are ways to navigate and to do it respectfully. I have to say that even today, even this year, 2021, I encountered, to my surprise, but not, that a community, a First Nation, was reluctant for media to come recently. And I had to help out as an Indigenous journalist and be that bridge between that community and our newsroom. And it's a responsibility that I took on because I want those stories to be told. I want our newsroom to be able to tell them. And I basically, you know, was able to help that community build that bridge and get them to be able to share their story with a broader audience. And, you know, to me, that's a relationship that I'm going to watch now. I'm going to keep an eye on that relationship. You know, maybe a community that's around the same area, they might not need me to be a bridge. They may already have that relationship with media. But you know what really helped in this one recent scenario? I had a reporter on my team. I said, call this community. They've got some really neat things going on there. There's some stories there. I said, call there, talk to a counselor, let them know we're interested. And that one phone call many, many weeks ago was a bridge to today's harder news. because we had reached out, because we had shown an interest, they remembered that journalist, they remembered us, and through us, we were able to contribute to an accountability story that CBC recently published. And every scenario, I want to say, will be different. And one of the reasons that I recently helped the Native American Journalism Association produce media guides is to help establish at least a foundation for journalists who want to do these stories. And we did that because I felt there needed to be at least something out there that is a reference sheet. Thank you for that, Robin. And that's absolutely where it is. I shared that this morning. There's news on the Manitoba Métis Federation this morning, and it's unfolding probably right now as we speak. But the Manitoba Métis Federation is separating from the Métis National Council. What does all that mean? It's complicated. So we knew that there were going to be reporters wanting to do these stories. And we thought, here's at least some guides that we can help to build a foundation to at least answer some of those questions going in. But we don't just have these guides. There's newsroom training that we do. And we are also, we're not only just training newsrooms in the US, such as the New York Times, but we are also offering it to some of our colleagues in Indigenous news outlets. But that training really is to help any newsroom that wants to go about doing these stories. And, it's kind of just the basics. Here's some basics to get you started. And then now you can go in and here's some questions that you can ask to get some context, because there's one word, which is Indigenous, but, in reality, that one word can be replaced with hundreds of other words. I threw out my nation, Anishinaabe. That's one word that can be replaced instead of using Indigenous over and over again. People really want to be identified by their nations, by their communities. And it's our responsibility that when we're publishing stories on First Nations, Métis and Inuit people and communities, that we're able to give as much context as we can with the amount of words that we have. So rather than saying Indigenous person, rather than saying First Nations person, you can say Anishinaabe person, or Cree person, or Gahaga person, which is Mohawk in their language. So really that newsroom training and these guides is to just broaden that thinking, and not be stuck into these formats and these words, and for us to be able to really educate more with the stories that we're telling. And one way that journalists can develop and maintain better relationships and trust with the communities is super simple. And I think that we all do it in our regular jobs, is just thinking more about the source and the person and how they don't understand our nature. A lot of times they don't understand the process. They don't understand that it's going to take time to do an interview, to get some other interviews that you may need for that story. They don't understand how it's going to go through an editing process. And, I think that a lot of those conversations really do put people at ease. But I've been around some of the best journalists, and they've been Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and it's been in the APTN newsroom. And what I've heard is just these really careful gloves. Some of the most sensitive interviews that I was overhearing in my newsroom was with residential school survivors. And it was very sensitive stories on how they were being treated and their claims were being treated by lawyers. So there is a legal layer to that story. But at the ground level, these sources that we call them, they're people. And these people have, no understanding of broadcasting, journalism, media. They have a traumatic story. And the care that I've heard journalists do is to prepare them for the interview, to also prepare them for perhaps how they may feel after the interview. I've heard a journalist say, will you be there with family? Will you have someone there with you during the interview? And also following up afterwards and letting them know the publication is coming. And that takes time. That takes time and it takes attention. And I think you're all aware of the attention and detail that it takes to do this job. So it's in our toolkit. I really see that all of the tools that we have as journalists, what we learn in school, what we learn on the job, those tools are applicable to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. We just need to be thoughtful of them and mindful of the stories that we're trying to put out. And we don't want to see stories that dwell on poverty. We don't want to see stories that are stereotypical in nature. And I do need to reference how I did speak out about a story like that one time. I did it on behalf of the Native American Journalists Association, and I did it for Inuit. I was seeing people hurt and outraged on Twitter, and some folks even felt that they had been harmed by the reporter or the outlet. And so I saw that, and I think I put my phone down and said, oh no, what did the New York Times do? How bad is this? And my work at the Native American Journalists Association is to hold mainstream media accountable when articles like that go out. I was very new to the board when this happened. And we have a resource, which is a bingo card. And we encourage newsrooms, journalists to use that bingo card if they have questions about whether or not their content is stereotypical. I sat down on my kitchen table with the New York Times article and the Naja bingo card. And the New York Times won bingo. They had poverty, suicide, so many derogatory terms. There were even new things that I could add to that bingo card. And then I got a real understanding of why people were hurt. I got a real understanding of why there was that outrage. And I felt, because I worked for APTN for the last 20 years, the world's first national Aboriginal television network that is there to cover and tell stories for Inuit, I felt that I had a duty to speak out in any way that I could through the platform that I had. And I'm really glad that we were able to do that. It raised awareness and people were able to see really what a modern day stereotypical story looks like. We actually took it a step further with the New York Times by auditing their stories, and we put out a spotlight report on the New York Times recently, which you can find online. And I have not had to do that with Canadian media. It's absolutely something that we are able to do at Naja. But there have been plenty of times over the course of my career where I have seen mainstream media come out and make big mistakes when it comes to Indigenous news coverage. And being at APTN, I was very thankful to be there and to be very thankful that we didn't make those mistakes too. But that was an opportunity to learn. Those opportunities, those mistakes, those errors, they are opportunities for mainstream media to learn, to correct, issue corrections or apologies if necessary. And, you know, working with APTN, we were able to influence mainstream media. And I say that because there were a lot of stories that we were doing in the early years on police brutality, missing and murdered women. And those stories did start coming to the forefront as years went on. And, you know, we started being invited to more communities, stories started coming to us more. And we realized that we needed to start an investigative unit. And I was part of that when APTN started its investigative unit. And I think that's another way to develop and maintain better relationships and trust with reluctant communities, to go more in depth. And we can't always do 30 minutes of investigative news on communities, but there are ways to add more context and to be able to present more of a picture of a community and what people are really having to say about what's going on. And so those are just a few things that I think would help maintain those relationships. But maintaining is another good word in that question that I think is important. And that maintenance of that relationship is that you don't just show up when it's really terrible news, or it's the top story news that everybody's hungry for. There's also the other stories that are going on in those communities of culture and art, music, resilience. So I think communities are really looking at that, and they're not going to shy away from being honest. They're going to say, you guys only come out here when there's a bad story going on. And that's been something I've seen happen historically as well. You know, the question here from Marianne, I think, is very timely. And it's something I've thought about a lot lately too. How do you manage to remain calm and poised with such emotional stories and when mistakes occur? I want to say that mistakes, that's a whole nother topic. But I remain calm and poised because I'm grounded in my culture. And I have always been grounded in my culture. It has helped me through all of the tough times. And I have to say, in 22 years of doing these stories, there have been so many emotional and tough times. But I'll be honest that this year has been probably one of the toughest that I've seen in memory. And of course, it's due to the findings in Kamloops. And it is due to the First Nations that are doing ground searches for unmarked graves in their communities. And I did want to talk about this. And what I do want to say about this is that I've had a couple of experiences in this area throughout my career. And just my advice to journalists is don't let stories go away. Don't let what you hear be the story that got away. And I say that because I was recently in a talk about sources, and they mentioned that, you know, the one that got away. And I was asked, you know, what was your story, the one that got away? And I couldn't think of it. And, you know, hearing another journalist tell about that story that got away and how he thought it was such an outrageous story that it couldn't possibly be a story and then sees it on another outlet. We as journalists don't want that to happen to us. But when it came to these stories of unmarked graves, there are quite a few journalists in our community who have heard these stories before 2021. I'm one of them. When I was producer of APTN Investigates, there was a story that we worked on unmarked graves. And I think this was in 2014, I want to say. I was tasked with hosting that particular show. I was also the producer. Most recently, the story surfaced again, and I watched it back. The first words out of my mouth were, "It's common knowledge that there are unmarked graves at residential schools in Canada." You know, I think back on that, and I think back, you know, what could I have done? What could we have done? Could we have done more? Could we have covered the stories then? And I know that I'm not the only journalist who's had that thought in the past few months. There are dozens of journalists who covered the TRC hearings and heard the stories from the mouths of survivors themselves. When the story of Kamloops was announced, I realized I had been there. I realized that was the first residential school that I had ever been inside and walked through the halls of. And that's because I was producing APTN's political show, Nation to Nation. We didn't take our show on the road a lot, but we took our show on the road. We went to meet Elder Joanne Gottfriedson and told her story, but also the story of how Kamloops First Nation and over 100 other First Nations are suing the federal government on behalf of day scholars. And that was a story that we went there to do, that political story. But Joanne shared her story with us. We smudged with Joanne. We had food with Joanne. She showed us around the school. She took us to the place where she was abused. And she showed us the orchids on the grounds of the school where they talked about the unmarked graves. And that was a couple of years ago. So when this news hit in June, I went back to that and I remembered that. And again, you know, like what could we of media done more of, and how did those stories never get further investigated? So that remaining calm is one thing that helps because of my culture. And honestly, I'm really blessed that I have that, my culture. I'm really grateful to have my father, who's a journalism elder and guided me throughout my whole career. Recently, when the executive director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation was appointed, I went to my dad and I said, "Dad, look, another one of your students is making the news." My dad trained and staffed the majority of the folks who started APTN. Those were all his students that I worked with when I started the studio crew there. He had trained them through the Aboriginal Broadcast Training Initiative. He did 2 courses there. He also helped train a TikTok influencer by the name of Sherry McKay. She attended his training at the Adam Beach Film Institute. You know, so I went to him and I said, "Dad, there are so many things going on in this industry now. The community of journalists that you helped train, we're going through a lot. And there is perceived, I want to say, infighting. I was seeing things on Twitter where there was Indigenous journalists admonishing other Indigenous journalists. And I'm a community person. I didn't feel comfortable seeing that. I wasn't happy seeing APTN's name being dragged on social media. And I said, Dad, the network you founded, the network where I worked, look at all these things that are being said. And, how do we get back to a place where the communities want us there to be telling our stories? And how do we help each other be strong in order to tell these stories? Because we need to be strong so that we can tell the stories for our communities and bring those questions to leadership, to the forefront. And because it is of public interest, our stories are of public interest. And at my parents' kitchen table, my father drafted a proposal for the Center for Indigenous Journalism, and that is my next mission, to take the Center for Indigenous Journalism and create a boot camp program for Indigenous journalism through the Native American Journalists Association. Our members are Indigenous and non-Indigenous. Our organization has been there holding media to account and trying its best to see that Indigenous journalists are working in mainstream outlets. And we've been doing this work for nearly 40 years. And that's why I chose to do my work with the Native American Journalists Association, because they and their mandate, it is in full alignment with myself, my career, and my sovereignty. The industry has put a huge demand on us lately. That demand is, it's a matter of supply and demand as well. It's not just a matter of demand on our resources, our contacts, our knowledge, but a demand on our supply. And I'm looking around, I'm talking to my colleagues. We want to fill positions. We want Indigenous journalists everywhere. We want them on national television in the United States because there are none there. In Canada, we do have Indigenous journalists on national news. Krishna Jakute at CTV. We had Connie Walker at CBC and all the national reporters at APTN. That's not mirrored over there. And what's not mirrored over here is the investments in Indigenous journalism, because there are people investing into programs and creating them with us. We just unveiled a scholarship program this year, $70,000 US, full tuition scholarships for 2 Indigenous journalists to attend NYU. I'm very proud of that program, and I want to see those programs mirrored in Canada. And I have been really anxious this year, and I have felt like calling a state of emergency, quite frankly, in Indigenous journalism. And those outlets out there who are demanding us, those institutions, colleges, and universities who want us, investments need to be made. Scholarship programs, career paths. I would love to see an Indigenous person like myself have a seed planted in high school and end up as an executive producer one day. You know, maybe even we could attract kids in kindergarten the same way I was. But that's really the heart of it for me. And I really wanted to be able to speak about all of these things because they're very near and dear to my heart. I've learned so many lessons through the work that I've been privileged to do for APTN. And that network, they helped me every step of the way. I started out there volunteering to be the script assistant. I got trained to be a director. They had mentorships for me, on-the-job mentorships. And you know what? That gave me the adrenaline, that gave me the initiative and the drive, and I felt like I could do anything. And I really tried. I went and applied for a job at MSNBC in New York. I was so inspired to do television directing. I wanted to do it for 24 hours a day. So I tried to get that job with MSNBC. I got the interview. I got a tour of Rockefeller Center. And, you know, I was really lucky though, because APTN was calling me back. They kept, you know, saying, we need you here to fill in. And I said, you know what, if I'm going to go back, I got to go back in a different way. You know, I got as far as I could with the technical side, and there's more work to be done on the editorial side. And I want to be a producer one day because I never got to do that yet. So they brought me back, and that started my my editorial career in 2008. I was brought back to be a researcher writer, and again, starting from the bottom. And I wasn't shy about starting from the bottom. Again, to me, it was cool. I was going to be a researcher writer, learn the ropes, get my chops as a writer, and also, you know, get to work with the producers. I wanted to work with the producers all of these years and learn from their minds and sponge just as much as I could from them. So that was my entrance into editorial, and soon after I started as a producer. But I want to touch on a question here. How do you take care to build relationships with sources when you're on a tight deadline? I think there are still absolutely ways to be respectful of a person when you are on a tight deadline, you know, and make it clear to them. I have talked to so many folks on the phone, elders, political leaders, young people, lots of journalists. And, you know, sometimes, you know, you could picture it as being maybe on a phone with a really excited and keen journalist, right? They want to keep talking to you and tell you about their story, but you're like, I gotta go. And you can really just do it in that way, you know, like, listen, I've got a tight deadline. Really thank you for giving me this time and helping me with this quote. I will let you know when it's published, and try to follow up back with that person later down the line. One of the tools that I always try to throw out there with reporters, any assignment and story pitch meetings, is do a follow-up. Oftentimes we do stories on people, they're doing something, and then we don't follow up. Like, did they complete it? Did they do it? Was their mission accomplished? And, you know, perhaps that character has something new for you, a story that you weren't expecting. So I know our deadlines are really, really tight, and I am connected with our newsroom here in Manitoba. I do work for CBC Indigenous. We are a digital unit, but I am connected with the Manitoba newsroom and that daily news cycle. And there are, oh man, that daily news cycle, it's some days it's like a few cycles going on in one day. And there's efforts going on in our industry for diversity. And I see that. It is good to see. And I think it has made people comfortable, such as myself, to move into mainstream outlets. Like I said, I was with APTN for that first 20 years, and I saw that CBC hired an Indigenous advisor. I noticed when they started their Indigenous unit, you know, almost a decade ago, I noticed it and I was like, wow, that's really great. CBC's doing that. And when they had the position for assignment producer, I said, you know, I can go to that unit as an assignment producer, and it's a really good sign that they have an Indigenous advisor there, because, you know, there have been stories of discrimination in newsrooms, lack of diversity in newsrooms, and it was never a place that I thought that I would ever amount to, honestly. And very, very thankful to APTN. And I think there's a lot of people out there who would echo that, because a lot of us in the industry today, we got to start there at APTN and moved on to doing other really great things. The executive director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, she didn't only take my dad's Aboriginal broadcast training program, but she was a producer at APTN. And I worked with her on a story. She took me out on a shoot with her, and we did women in prison stories. And I learned so much from that. She wanted a female shooter on that shoot because we were going into the prison for women in Kingston. We were also going into a traditional prison in Saskatchewan. So it had to be a woman shooter, and I was the only woman on the crew. And you know, those were some really groundbreaking moments those years. I was super nervous about going into a prison. You know, I didn't know what kind of story we were going to tell from there, but it was really exciting to be on the road, to get off the airplane and throw the camera on my shoulder, and then work on the script, see the story get edited, and then have it presented on TV. It feels like a really huge accomplishment when you're able to be part of a story from the start to the finish, from pitch to publication, I say. And I've had a lot of great opportunities to be in stories, whether it's being a shooter or a reporter or a producer. And, you know, how can non-Indigenous journalists of color serve First Nations communities? You know, I think we can all serve First Nations communities. And I think all journalists can do any story. And I know that's a controversial thing to say, and people may not agree with me, but Indigenous journalists don't always want to be the Indigenous beat reporter. They don't always want to be the Indigenous person doing all the Indigenous stories. I just remember talking to a colleague of mine the other night who's doing financial reporting, and she's went from being at a Indigenous affairs desk, and now she's a financial beat reporter, and she's, you know, super happy being able to do that. And I think back to my dad, you know, yeah, he was the Indigenous journalist and visible and invited to communities as a role model to speak, but he was doing stories on everything. He actually did one on rap music and how rap music was just becoming a thing. And he went and interviewed a DJ. He went to a club where people like were dancing to the hip hop music. And that was back in the late 80s when hip hop music was just emerging. So that was nothing to do with an Indigenous story whatsoever. And it's funny, somehow that story is still on YouTube. But that was, you know, that was the real inspiration for me, was seeing my dad on TV. We would sit in front of the TV, 6 o'clock dinner time, me and my sisters, and we would mimic him. We would run around after, we'd be like, Jim Compton, CBC News, Winnipeg. And my mom would hear these like 3 little girls running around the house saying this. And, you know, that is what I would love to see for a lot of Indigenous kids, all kids in general. One of the things that I tell my newsroom nowadays is to try to picture a modern day classroom. You know, when it comes to diversity in newsrooms, diversity means all communities, all people, all backgrounds. And I say, you know, let's think of that classroom. You know, does our newsroom and our coverage reflect that classroom of all those kids from all over? Some are from different countries, some are newcomers, some have parents who have immigrated to Canada or grandparents. And it's just a mixture of diversity in those classrooms. And that's probably also the kid in me. You know, there's definitely a kid in me. I'm not shy to admit that, because you know, this industry, it gets me really excited and it gets me really pumped up when we're able to tell these stories for our people, but also to hear back from them. That is an amazing feeling, and it's authentic. You cannot pay for that. You know, to hear from a mom that you told a story about their child, and it changed their child, or it inspired their child, or it helped them to be thanked by a mom, to be thanked by a daughter for doing a story on her dad's fight for his First Nations rights. Those are the jewels that I'll put on my crown. But the real rewards are when we're able to change things, if it's history or the future. And especially legislation. I have to say my political news coverage has always been with a focus on First Nations communities at the ground level and with the federal government. And I think that if there was more awareness of First Nations politics and the way that First Nations are governed under the Indian Act, there would likely be national outrage, at least with those of us who are politically aware, invested. And you know, that just goes back to this election. We just had this election, but I can tell you there have been other federal elections going on. First Nations elections are federal elections. Swan Lake First Nation in Manitoba just elected a new chief and replaced a chief that had been there for 12 to 14 years. But you know what's really unique about that is the chief is also a counselor. And this is not the only First Nation where that dynamic is. I can tell you that my First Nation, Sandy Bay Ojibwe First Nation, the chief there is also a counselor. Those dynamics are permitted under the Indian Act and the electoral codes that each First Nation has. There is an election coming in Sioux Valley Dakota Nation in Manitoba, and another election coming out for Penimutang First Nation in Manitoba. There's election stories for days in First Nations. But the heart of these election stories, I think, that would interest Canadians and be of public interest is the democracy side of the stories. And, you know, are the citizens getting the democracy that they deserve with their elected chiefs and councils? And it's things like this, it's these little nuggets, these little facts that Canadian media, I think, should be interested in. And I think the Canadian public would be interested in. And certainly the First Nation citizens in each of these communities would be interested in. You know, so I really feel that there are so many more emerging stories that are to come from our First Nations. I really am proud of CBC Indigenous and the network for having the unit, and also the work that's being done on the diversity fronts. And it does need to be done in a lot of other places. But what a concern that we have at the Native American Journalists Association, say, for example, I'm going to use CNN as an example. CNN is a network that we had to make a statement about because on federal election night in the United States, they decided, CNN decided to make a category called something else. They made the editorial decision to group various groups of people into a category called something else. And they refused to apologize for that on-air mistake. And I said something about mistakes earlier, and I wanna raise that now, that when I asked my dad about mistakes, I said, it looks like APTN has made some mistakes. And he told me that mistakes are a gift, and that the networks need to see these mistakes as gifts that are being presented to them so that they can make right by them. That is an opportunity. And so it was really disappointing to see that when we met with executives from CNN, that they were not going to go forward with an apology. But I do have a very good understanding of those editorial decisions that go into making editors' notes, corrections, maybe even unpublishing a story. So I knew that we had a strong case, and that CNN could very well have said, you know what, we will make an apology, and we'll do it at prime time, at the same time, same show, same anchor, hopefully reach the same audience. And that was their gift that they chose not to accept. And they may have an opportunity again one day, but we talked, and we thought, what can we recommend to CNN next? What can we really say to them? We can't actually recommend that they start an Indigenous Affairs desk, which is something that we would recommend to networks. We do make that recommendation, but we felt, how could we tell them to start that desk when there are no protections there for an Indigenous person? Would they have an ally? Would they drown under editorial decisions? So we didn't make that recommendation, but we would absolutely want to see these done in a careful way, in a meaningful way, and funded so that they have longevity and they're not just projects, one-offs. Perhaps a unit is established just to do a series of stories on residential schools, could be one example, when really and truly a unit should be established to do all Indigenous stories. And so, yeah, that's when it comes to collaboration, those desks need to be established. Indigenous journalists need to be everywhere. And the colleagues, that we work with, absolutely we have teachings for our colleagues as well. We're not, as journalists, we're not the only source. There are other Indigenous people out there to get source information from. And I just wanted to make sure I got this question correct here from Korea. How much source collaboration involvement is necessary when working on stories for Indigenous communities? I think you're going to get a sense of that when you start talking to someone from a community. One community is going to be different from another. There are some folks that I've talked to for the first time who have never talked to a reporter before, and they were afraid that I was going to spin the story and drag them into some controversy and spin it to be negative. And I had to say, no, actually, I'm looking to have your voice to give me that information that these other people can't. There is already controversy going on in my story, but I need you to be able to tell me about your community. I need you to be able to tell me about maybe your community is doing a citizenship act. There's a lot of things going on in First Nations communities, same way as things would go on with a city council. So that's what I say when I say there's tons of stories out there, political or non-financial accountability as well. And I do have recommendations for workshops. My number one recommendation is going to be through the Native American Journalists Association and our newsroom training, because it's tailored to the newsroom or the classroom that is receiving the training. None of the speeches that I do are the same. And I try to speak from the heart every time that I talk to a group of people, whether it's Indigenous or non. I just really try to keep it real and share my experiences, because I've had so many wonderful opportunities and a super colorful career. And it was so inspirational to be part of all those firsts with APTN, and to see this industry open up to a point where I felt comfortable leaving my home. APTN was like my home community in a sense. And I left there and came to mainstream. And I'm very impressed with what I'm seeing being done at my network. And I know that it can be done at all networks and at all journalism institutions. Another training resource that we always refer to anytime we do newsroom training, we point to the OG of Indigenous newsroom training, and that is the Reporting in Indigenous Communities website, riic.ca, and it was created by Duncan McHugh. It's a living resource. I also want to share with you that it's used inside CBC. That training is what facilitators will do inside of our network and offer to various departments, various levels of leadership. And I'm actually someone who has not taken that training. I have read the website, but I am going to take the training because I feel that it's something that we should try to always kind of refresh ourselves on, and to hear from more people. You've heard from me this morning, and I really appreciate you for taking the time to listen to me and let me share some of my personal experiences throughout my career. But I think we do need to hear from more Indigenous journalists in platforms like this. The NAJA conference will be coming to Canada in the future. We have had a difficult time trying to get one off in the last couple of years due to the global pandemic, of course. We do plan to have one in 2022 in Phoenix. I know everyone can't come down to Phoenix, but we are going to be bringing it to Canada. And I want that to happen because I am Anishinaabe Kwe from the Anishinaabe Nation. My nation starts from east of the Great Lakes and it straddles the Great Lakes, and it goes to the west. And I'm here in Winnipeg. My Anishinaabe Nation is on both sides of the border, and I exercise my sovereignty and carry dual citizenship through the Jay Treaty. And that's why I strongly believe that this one organization is representative of all Indigenous journalists in Canada and the US, and all of our allies in Canada and the US. The conference that we put on is, it's very special. It's different. It's a showcase of culture and pride. And it's really inspirational to see all of the journalists, but not just the old schoolers or the ones that are in like my circle, but you know what? It blows my mind to see how many student Indigenous journalists we have through the organization. They're out there in colleges, they're in universities, they're starting their careers. And I just want to dig a little bit deeper. I want to get some of them like in their high school years. I want them to be inspired from then, and don't give up and don't drop out. Get that degree. And there are going to be jobs. There are a lot of jobs, and it is a tough industry. It is so tough. I see so many colleagues and I admire them. I love their voices, their faces, their passion to tell stories. And I love getting to know them. And I think that's what we need to do more, is get to know each other in our industry more, to learn where we're from, to learn that this big loud radio voice or this big TV personality, in reality, they're behind the scenes an introvert just like me, and they're shy just like me. And I think that the more that we're able to do that in the community that is journalism, and in the community that welcomes Indigenous journalists and our stories right across the board, I just think that there's so much more that we could do if we were to be able to come together a lot more and teach. I think that journalism can be viewed as just so hard lined and like your pencil has to be the sharpest, but if you take an approach to it, which has helped me, is a storytelling approach. You're there to tell stories for the people, and you're giving them a voice, whether it's on TV or on a digital platform. And you're just going to follow these rules and this format to get that story to the people who need it. And so I just try to approach it with that in mind. And I would love to help any journalist aspiring in school, on the job. I would love to be able to help alleviate some fears, work on stories. I love collaborating. I saw a question in here about collaboration, and I was thinking, are they asking about collaborating with perhaps, APTN or something? Which is another option, collaborate with an Indigenous journalist or an Indigenous outlet. There are tons, and they're ever emerging. And I think that would really just help the landscape. A lot of things that I've been hearing lately is that the newsrooms, they have to mirror the populations that they're serving. And I mean, if we just look at the diversity out our window, then we know where we need to go with the stories in our newsrooms. And that top story today, maybe it is kids that have to go back into the classroom, and it's that top story. It was the breaking news this morning. That one story can be diverse, because guess what? The kids who have to go back to that classroom today, they're diverse. And so that's where I'm going to leave things off for now. If anyone is comfortable turning on their camera to ask a question that's not in the chat, I'm open for that.
Francine, before we actually open up, I don't know if you actually missed a question in the chat. I saw up above, there was one person that asked, how different, similar are media relations with First Nations across the provinces? That was one question I noticed a bit above.
The provinces. Yeah, that actually is a good one. Some First Nations have bigger groups that will have communications representatives. So this First Nation community may want the reporter to go to the bigger organization that actually has a communications representative. We got to understand that there isn't a director of communications for every chief, and there isn't a press secretary for every First Nation. And it may take a little bit of navigating to find perhaps the tribal council in Manitoba. My First Nation is also part of the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council. It's also part of the Southern Chiefs Organization. And it's also part of the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And it's also part of the Assembly of First Nations. So some ground First Nations may have connections to other governing bodies. And so that's Manitoba, for example. In Saskatchewan, there's many First Nations that are under the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations. So each province would have a bigger governing body to help represent all of the First Nations on the ground. In BC, it's the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And so it absolutely is different with every province. But one thing we got to remember is the relationship between First Nations is really between the federal government and the First Nation. And so to figure out, where the First Nation connects to the province, it's usually child welfare because the province will administer the child welfare money. So, you know, there's so many layers. It's like a field of onions, not even just one onion. That layers need to be peeled back. But you know what, that really is a good question. You know, when I started at APTN, I'm from a Manitoba First Nation. I grew up in Winnipeg. I didn't have news exposure to Indigenous news in BC or in Atlantic Canada. So I learned a lot working at APTN. I learned about the Mi'kmaq. I learned about fishing rights and the Donald Marshall Jr. Supreme Court decision. I learned about Gustafson Lake and how the Canadian government called in the army on Sundancers. And when I learned that, I was very shocked and a little bit upset that I hadn't heard that on the news. And why did I have to learn about that at APTN? You know, so there's different stories in every province because there's different nations throughout the country, over 600 First Nations, hundreds of languages. And it's just really beautiful when you're able to get to learn about each part of the country, you know, to learn the Mi'kmaq Nation and some of their traditions, you know. And then again in Quebec is going to be different as well with the Innu Nation and the North. That's going to be different from the provinces. So, you know, it really is going to take that work for us journalists to do the research, you know, do that ground research, kind of figure out where everything's at, what connects to who, and, you know, how does things work. And it's been challenging to talk to people in communities during the pandemic. I'm going to say for myself working from home. And it is still possible though, that diligence that we all have built in us to be like picking up the phone and demanding answers. It's the same way when we want to chase someone, you know, like, hey, you know, I'm looking for someone from your community who would like to talk to me about this. You know, maybe you got a cousin or an auntie and I think that really works. So it doesn't really matter where in the country, which province you're in. As long as you know where the First Nation is, how the relationship first and foremost is with the federal government. And one thing I want to say is don't be shy to ask questions and, you know, to come in as somebody who's there to learn. And that's really my approach too, is like, you know, tell me about the community, tell me what's going on there. I don't understand that. Can you just, you know, clear that one up for me? Tell me that one again, or, you know, that's in the Indian Act. Oh, what section of the Indian Act is that in? You know, I got to go and research that. I think the more that you can understand, the better. And an Indigenous story is like any other story where sometimes you really just need to stop, put your thinking cap on, your editor cap on, and do the work.
So if anyone, we're going to open it up to the floor. Anyone want to ask any more questions? We had a lot of great questions in chat, but if anyone wants to unmute themselves or ask any questions to Francine, feel free to do so now. I think Cedric, you have a question, you can go.
Hi, yeah. I personally am very interested in reporting. Let me just get Francine's face in front of me. Okay, there it is. Okay. I'm very interested in reporting into isolated communities, but I've been having a hard time finding opportunities or any kind of, projects or any kind of opportunities that go up there. You talked about Northern Quebec, and I'd be interested in Northern Quebec specifically. So I've been having a hard time really finding anything about that. So
I'm going to say that a real leader in Indigenous news has been APTN and the work being done at CBC. And Northern Quebec is, as far as I know, it's known as Nunavik. And those communities are very, very hard to get to. And I think communication sometimes can be a barrier, because what I've come to learn is that perhaps it's not French or English that is the first language, but it's the Indigenous language that's first. Then maybe French is second, and then English might be third. So I've had reporters in the day really struggle to make those contacts and connections. But you know what has helped? He went there. He was able to go to the communities. I want to say Kuujjuaq is one of them. And, you know, not just for the terrible stories of a police brutality or suicide crisis, but there was an in-depth story done on the Nunavik court system. And that was, you know, that got the reporter into the community. And after that, if there was something that was going on there, he was able to say, you know what, I got some contacts. They might not really have a good signal today, but tonight they might get their Wi-Fi better. If I call this organization, they might drop into that organization today or tomorrow. You know, we really sort of try to get a picture how things are on the ground in the communities and what obstacles may be there as far as communication geographically. Are they fly in? And do the citizens maybe only leave the community to go to court or to go for medical services? That may be one way to connect with members from a fly-in community, to try to meet them when they're coming to the urban centers for the services that they don't have in the communities. And that language barrier can be there, but there's potential for a translator if we're able to get people to help us do translations, or a colleague can maybe help with the interview if we need to have a French speaking colleague. And that would be my advice. I'm thinking specifically of Northern Quebec, but you know what? This could actually be similar in other parts of the country where people do need to fly out of their communities for services, whether it's medical or legal. And that's the case for much of the North. There was a story recently how women need to come down south to give birth. And as well as Northern Manitoba, many communities have citizens that need to come to Winnipeg for dialysis, for example. So even though we might not always be able to physically get there, you know, just knowing the people in the community better can help us just connect with the people that are from there. And there's opportunities. It's challenging, but again, journalism's challenging, and it's all part of the chase, right? And wanting to talk to people. I hope that helped.
Yeah, it did. I did go to Nunavik this summer, so I did meet quite a lot of people there. So I could definitely work on that and on the advice you gave me.
Beautiful. I would love to go up there. I've been lucky to go to Labrador. I was in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, Labrador, and I got to have tea in an Innu tent with an elder. And you may need to make time for that when you go to some communities where you gotta have some tea and hear some stories. But it's really rewarding, and it can really add to the color to what you're trying to report on as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump on with a question? Well, I want to close, if there's nothing else coming in. I want to close by acknowledging that tomorrow is the inaugural National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And it's, for me, going to take some getting used to, but it's really great to see that people are, becoming more aware of the histories, and the stories that have been told are being heard now and shared more. And it's really a good feeling to see the country, coming out and doing all of these things. And today, it's been a huge honor to speak to Concordia staff, students, alumni, and anyone else who has tuned in. And Harvin, I'm going to get to you. I want to finish this thought by saying that it's such an honor to be asked by a university, because as you heard, I really didn't have a hope and dream of being a university student. And, so for me, it's just really great to be able to talk to you students and see you all with your bylines in the future. I'd love to see that. But Harvin, you put your hand up. Can we hear from you?
Yeah, I just thought of a question. I just wanted to ask whether you've come across this before in your reporting, but when it comes to like covering environmental issues, like I've come to learn that there isn't one like homogeneous viewpoint among these different communities for like a pro-environment perspective. So like how do you approach like climate coverage in these communities?
That's a good question. And it has definitely been something that we had to navigate in our coverage of fracking, pipelines, liquid natural gas. We have to be able to hear out as many voices as we can. There are going to be people who are in favor of something such as the Muskrat Falls Dam, and there are going to be others who are not in favor of it. In each community, there will be historical stories that connect to the land, connect to the water. And I think that it's important to try to offer that context and some of those teachings, really, if we can, in our reporting. I will share with you that when I have a story pitched to me as a producer of an Indigenous newsroom or an Indigenous unit, I want to know what the Indigenous angle is and the relevance, and how many perspectives we can get on the one particular issue. And I think you're asking a very good question, because there's going to be a diverse range of opinions and reactions to those things that are affecting the land, affecting the way of life, affecting animals, affecting nature. And so we've seen it come up with Muskrat Falls. We've seen it come up with fracking in New Brunswick, fracking in Alberta, the pipeline, liquid natural gas pipelines. And the most important thing I think that we could do is to try to paint a fuller picture and to be able to say, here's the article that you got to read about this, that is going to give you all of the diverse opinions on it, and also let you know what the stakes are for each people, each side. And we always get these really great tools in our journalism training and in talks and from leaders, producers. And I think that we just got to realize that those tools, they do apply to Indigenous journalism as well. It's not a whole different thing of reinventing. It's just a different way of, knowing that it's other folks, different people, another community, they're real close to an urban center maybe, or they're really super remote. Like those are the things that we kind of got to keep in mind. And of course we know that when we say who it is, what's the story, where, and the why, we're always trying to answer those questions. But also we have formats that we fall back on as journalists. You know, we have a format where we start with a news hook, we break it down and give some context, and then we have the conflict, the helpers and the hinderers, the pro pipeline and the anti pipeline, you know, just to give an example. But then there could be someone in that community who doesn't have an opinion, pro or otherwise, and that could be that elder who's just there to say, you know what, I used to trap right on this line where this pipeline is being built, and we used to get the food from here, or, you know, it could affect the water this way. And there's a variety of voices that can be done for stories like that. And I think we're seeing, and we're going to see more environmental stories. And I would really, really like to see an Indigenous reporter take on a beat like that and make it their thing. I think it would be super awesome to see someone do that kind of work. So I hope that answers your question. Is there any other thing I could touch on there for you?
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right.
I mean, if anyone else has any questions, now's the time. But if not, I just want to take a moment again to thank you so much, Francine, for taking the time to be with us here today and sharing your own experience and such insight on Indigenous journalism and what journalists can do to better report on these stories, and giving everyone here all the resources. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone. The one link that I noticed wasn't dropped in the chat here, but it was a story that I mentioned, and I really want to make sure that you guys can see it if you'd like. It was a story by APTN's show Nation to Nation. APTN Nation to Nation went to Kamloops, and we interviewed Joanne Gottfriedson, and it is on a class action lawsuit for day scholars. And the day scholars, there is still more news coming out on that class action. And so that's one show that I hope that you guys are able to also check out. Thank you, Robin, so much. Chimigwech, Concordia, for inviting me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.